Scott Peterson told police he'd been fishing. That was his alibi. Fishing on Christmas Eve, alone, on San Francisco Bay. He said it calmly. He offered the detail without being asked. He described the weather. He mentioned where he'd parked. He told them what bait he used. And then when investigators came back to him, he told them again. Different words, same story, more detail. His wife Lacey had been missing for less than 24 hours. I want you to sit with that for a second. Because the question isn't whether Scott Peterson was lying. The question is why he couldn't stop talking. Every lawyer in America tells their clients the same two words, don't talk. And yet here is a man who had already hired a defense attorney, who already knew what was at stake, who was already under suspicion, and he kept going. He kept adding, he kept explaining. That pattern has a name. It has a psychology. And once you understand it, you will never watch an interrogation the same way again. Here's the first thing you need to understand about what happens inside an interrogation room. Silence is the correct answer. Legally, procedurally, strategically. Every criminal defense attorney on earth agrees on this. You have the right to remain silent. Use it. Full stop. And yet, across thousands of interrogations, documented in court transcripts and behavioral studies and recorded confessions, the same thing happens. The guilty party talks. They over-explain. They circle back to details the detective never asked about. They correct themselves. They anticipate questions that haven't come yet. And they keep going, past the point where any rational person would have stopped, until they have handed the investigation everything it needed. This is not stupidity. I want to be very clear about that, because the easy answer is to say, these people weren't smart enough to know better. Some of them had law degrees, some of them had rehearsed, some of them had been warned explicitly by counsel. They talked anyway. What we're going to look at today are the three psychological mechanisms that make silence, simple, legal, rational silence, feel unbearable for a guilty person. Not impossible, unbearable, because those are different problems. And understanding that difference is where this gets genuinely disturbing. Let's start with the first one. The human mind cannot hold two contradictory truths at the same time without trying to collapse them into one. This is not a flaw in weak people. It is a structural feature of human cognition. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance, the state of tension that exists when what you believe about yourself conflicts with something you've done. And the mind's response to that tension is not to accept it, it is to resolve it, by any means necessary. For a guilty person sitting in an interrogation room, that tension is catastrophic. On one side, I did this. On the other side, I am not the kind of person who does this. And the only tool they have, the only tool available to them in that room, in that moment, is language. So they use it. They explain, they contextualize, they build a version of events that allows both of those truths to coexist. Not for the detective, for themselves. The detective isn't the one who needs convincing. They are. This is why over-explanation sounds the way it does. It doesn't sound like a lie being performed for an audience. It sounds like someone working something out. Someone who needs to get to the end of the story, because the end of the story is where the tension lives. Scott Peterson didn't keep describing the fishing trip because he thought it made him look innocent. He kept describing it because describing it made him feel less guilty. Every detail was a small act of self-persuasion. Every repetition was the mind trying, again, to resolve the dissonance between what he'd done and who he believed himself to be. And here's the thing about cognitive dissonance. It doesn't care what's true. It cares what feels resolved. So the first mechanism isn't strategic at all. It's almost involuntary. The guilty person talks because talking is how the mind tries to manage pain it cannot otherwise process. But the second mechanism is different. The second mechanism is about something more deliberate, more fragile. For a specific psychological profile, and it appears consistently enough that behavioral analysts have mapped it, silence feels like surrender, not legal defeat, psychological surrender. Because if they go quiet, someone else controls the story. and for a certain type of person, that is completely intolerable. Chris Watts sat across from investigators for hours the morning his wife and daughters were reported missing. He was composed. He was cooperative. He cried at the appropriate moments. He told them he just wanted his family back. He took a polygraph voluntarily. He gave a press conference. He invited cameras into his home. He did all of this because staying in control of the narrative, being the devastated husband, the terrified father, the man who was helping, felt more manageable than silence. Silence would have handed the story to someone else. Here's the first thing you need to understand about narcissistic compulsion in an interrogation context. It is not about arrogance in the way most people think. It is about a need for the room, for the detective, for the camera, for whoever is present, to receive a specific version of events and reflect it back as true. They're not playing a long game. They're not thinking about trial. They are managing this moment, this detective, this specific dynamic, because the moment is the only thing that feels real to them right now. And so they perform, they add detail, they anticipate questions that weren't asked, they correct minor inaccuracies that have no strategic value. Because accuracy isn't the point, the performance is the point. Read through what I just described and notice something. The suspect isn't lying to the detective. They're lying to themselves through the detective. The detective is an audience, not an adversary. And the performance is for the performer. The genius of a skilled interrogator is that they understand this. They give the suspect the stage, they stay quiet, they look interested, they let the performance continue. And they take notes on every prop the suspect brings. We're going to get to the third mechanism in a moment, and it's the one that surprises people most. But first, if this is the kind of breakdown you came here for, subscribe. The whole channel is built on one question. Why did they do it? Every case, every profile, every pattern. That's all we do here. Subscribe if you want to stay in it. In every social interaction you've ever had, silence means something. You know this without thinking about it. When you ask someone a question and they go quiet, you read that quiet. You interpret it. Hesitation, discomfort, something being withheld. Human beings are wired to extract meaning from silence, and the meaning is almost never neutral. A guilty person knows this. They know exactly what their silence looks like from the outside. They have run the calculation. They understand on some level that going quiet in an interrogation room, in front of a detective who is already suspicious, who is already watching, looks like admission. So they talk, to prove they have nothing to hide. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's one of the most self-defeating loops in human psychology. The very act of trying to not look guilty, of filling the silence to demonstrate openness, generates more incriminating material than silence ever would have. O.J. Simpson's civil deposition is one of the most documented examples of this mechanism in action. He had already been acquitted. The criminal case was over. His attorneys advised him repeatedly, and still, he could not stop clarifying, correcting, expanding. Every answer created a new question he felt compelled to address. Every clarification introduced a new inconsistency. He sat in that deposition for hours, generating a behavioral record that the plaintiff's team used to methodically dismantle his account. Because silence to him felt like losing. And losing, even a civil case that couldn't touch his freedom, was psychologically unbearable. Here's what I want you to understand. The detective goes quiet on purpose. They already know how this works. They know that silence creates a vacuum and that a guilty person's psychology will not tolerate a vacuum. It will fill it, immediately, with something. That asymmetry, one person in the room who understands the mechanism, one person in the room who is being driven by it, is where most cases are made. The suspect thinks they're having a conversation. The detective knows there is no conversation. There is only a behavioral record being built in real time, one unprompted sentence at a time. Let's pull all three of these together, because separately they're interesting. Together they describe something much more disturbing. A guilty person walks into an interrogation room carrying three things they cannot put down. The first is cognitive dissonance, a state of psychological tension so acute that talking feels like the only way to manage it, not to confess, to resolve, to reach the version of the story where both truths can coexist. The second is the need for narrative control, a compulsion to be the one defining the story in the room, because handing that control to someone else is experienced as a kind of psychological annihilation. The third is the terror of silence, the knowledge, bone deep, of what silence looks like from the outside, and the decision made in every quiet moment to fill it, to prove, to demonstrate, to perform openness so visibly that suspicion has no place to land. And the interrogator walks in carrying none of those things. They walk in with patience, with silence, with the specific knowledge that the human sitting across from them is going to do most of the work. They don't need to break anyone down. The architecture is already broken. It was broken before the suspect sat down. Every word the suspect adds is data. Every correction is a flag. Every unprompted detail is a map. And the suspect provides all of it, voluntarily, because every psychological mechanism they possess is pushing them towards speech and away from the only thing that could protect them. That's the point. Staying silent is legally simple and psychologically nearly impossible for a guilty person. Not because they're not intelligent, because the very thing that makes them guilty, the need to control, to justify, to resolve, is the same thing that will not let them stop talking. The cage isn't the interrogation room, it's in their head, and they built it themselves. Scott Peterson was convicted of first-degree murder in 2004. The fishing alibi, the detail he volunteered, the story he repeated, the account he kept refining, was one of the prosecution's central threads. He didn't have to give them that. He had a lawyer. He had the right to silence. He had 2 words available to him that could have made everything harder. He chose a different path. And he chose it, I would argue, not because he was careless, but because every psychological mechanism he possessed told him that talking was safer than not talking. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If silence is the only rational answer, and it is, why is it the one answer most guilty people cannot give? Because rationality isn't driving, psychology is. And psychology doesn't care about your best interests. It cares about resolution, control, the unbearable feeling that if you just explain it one more time, with the right words in the right order, maybe this time it will land the way you need it to. It never does. Subscribe if you want to stay in it.